My name is Heinrich Müller, and in the winter of 1942, I was 23 years old, serving with the 6th Army near Stalingrad. When I first arrived in Russia, I believed the war would be over soon. That's what the newspapers said. That's what our officers told us. We had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, through endless fields, villages turned to ashes, and skies so wide they made you feel small. By December, the cold had become our true enemy. Our rifles froze, the voile turned thick like glue, and our boots cracked. We burned anything we could find, furniture, broken wagons, even pieces of houses, just to keep warm. I remember the sound of the wind howling through the ruins of Stalingrad. It wasn't just wind, it was a voice, constant, merciless. The city was destroyed, yet it fought back with every street, every cellar, every shadow. We lived underground, in cellars filled with smoke and frost. The Russians were only a few hundred meters away. At night, we heard their songs, low and deep. Sometimes, we shouted across the snow curses, jokes, anything to remind ourselves we were still human. One morning, we received orders to hold our position near the Red October factory. The Soviets were advancing again. I looked around at my comrades, thin, pale, eyes hollow from hunger. We were all the same, tired, frightened, pretending not to be. Then came the sound of artillery, distant at first, then closer, until the ground itself trembled. Snow and dust filled the air. We ran to the trenches, clutching our rifles, praying they wouldn't jam. When the shelling stopped, silence returned. Then the shouting, Russian voices, closed now. The battle began again, as it always did. Sudden, brutal, without end. That night, after the fighting, I sat beside a dying fire, my hands numb, my breath visible in the dark. I thought of home, my mother's small kitchen in Bavaria, the smell of bread. It felt like another life. One didn't know it then, but Stalingrad would become our grave. By late November, we knew something was wrong. The radio messages had changed in tone, shorter, nervous, uncertain. The Soviet attacks grew stronger, more organized. Then, one morning, the officers told us the truth. We were surrounded. The Russians had closed the ring around Stalingrad. No one was coming to relieve us. At first, we didn't believe it. We had the Luftwaffe, we had tanks, we had discipline. But soon, we understood what it meant. The skies were gray for days at a time, and no planes came. The trucks stopped arriving. The bread rations were cut in half, then in half again. We ate frozen horse meat, boiled leather belts, anything that would keep us alive another day. Some men searched the ruins for food. Others simply sat in silence, staring at nothing. The temperature dropped below -30. Our breath froze on our scarves, our fingers stuck to the metal of our rifles. We no longer feared death, only cold and hunger. One night, I was sent on patrol with 2 others. The snow glowed faintly under the moon, and we moved through the ruins like ghosts. We reached a burned-out tram, its iron frame twisted and black. Inside, we found what looked like sacks of potatoes. When we opened them, we saw that they were bodies, frozen stiff, half buried in snow. Civilians. We covered them again and moved on without a word. When we returned, we found that our unit had lost another man, Franz, a boy barely 19. He had gone to the river to fetch water and never came back. We found his body the next morning, lying by the ice, his canteen still in his hand. I remember the officer saying, "Hold your position. The Fuhrer will not abandon you." We wanted to believe him. We had to. But each day, the horizon grew quieter. No engines, no planes, no hope. Inside the pocket, time stopped meaning anything. Days blurred into nights. Letters from home stopped coming. We stopped shaving, stopped talking about the end of the war. Sometimes, I caught myself thinking not about victory or defeat, but about something simple, bread, warmth, sleep without fear. The Russians were getting closer every day. You could feel it, in the ground, in the air, in the way our officers stopped looking us in the eyes. By Christmas, we were surrounded not just by the enemy, but by the silence of the dying. By January, the city was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. Everything was frozen, the rubble, the rivers, even the dead. We lived in the cellars of ruined buildings, wrapped in blankets that smelled of smoke and mold. Our breath hung in the air like fog. At night, the ice cracked beneath the ruins, echoing like distant gunfire. The wounded lay together in corners, silent except for their breathing. There were no bandages left, no morphine. Sometimes we took rags from the dead to bind the living. We had no fuel. To keep warm, we burned books, furniture, even our own wooden rifle stocks. The fire gave off little heat, and the smoke stung our eyes. but without it, we would freeze before morning. The Russians shelled us day and night. The noise never stopped, only changed rhythm, like the beating of a drum. When it paused, the silence felt worse. Once, we saw a plane in the distance. A German transport, maybe? It dropped a few parachutes, white against the gray sky. We ran to them, hoping for food or medicine. Inside the crates, we found ammunition for the wrong caliber of gun. That night, someone laughed, a dry, broken laugh, and it spread among the men until it turned to coughing. We weren't angry anymore, just empty. Our rations were down to a handful of flour mixed with snow. Some boiled it into a paste. Others ate candles, soap, anything. The horses were long gone. One evening, I went outside to look at the sky. The snow had stopped, and for the first time in weeks, I could see stars. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. I thought of my father, who had fought in the Great War. He used to tell me that war was mud and noise, not glory. I used to think he was bitter. Now I knew he had only told the truth. The next morning, our sergeant gathered us and said, "There will be no retreat. The Fuhrer orders us to fight to the last man." No one spoke. We just looked at each other. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were survivors waiting for the inevitable. When the shells began again, I didn't take cover. I simply sat and listened to the explosions, to the wind, to the city dying around me. It was no longer about winning. It was about not dying today. By the end of January, we knew it was over. No one said it aloud, but you could see it in every face, in the hollow eyes, the trembling hands, the silence that followed each explosion. The Soviets were closing in from all sides. The front was no longer a line. It was a circle shrinking around us. Every day, our perimeter grew smaller. We retreated from house to house, room to room. Our officers tried to keep order, but the chain of command was crumbling. Radios stopped working, ammunition ran out, and the wounded begged to be left behind. The medics could do nothing but cover them with blankets and whisper prayers. In the streets, frozen corpses lay stacked like firewood. Some had snow covering their faces. They looked peaceful, almost asleep. I envied them. One morning, we heard tanks approaching, the deep rumble of Soviet armor. The ground shook beneath us. We fired our last shells, knowing they would do little. The Russians kept coming, slow and unstoppable, like the winter itself. When the shells hit nearby, I was thrown into a wall. Dust filled my lungs, my ears rang. I crawled to my rifle, but it was bent, useless. I looked around and saw only smoke and shattered brick. Then came the shouting, Russian voices, orders, gunfire. They were in the building next door. Our sergeant, bleeding from the leg, looked at me and said quietly, "Muller, it's finished." He reached for his pistol, stared at it for a moment, then dropped it. That evening, word spread that Field Marshal Paulus had surrendered. The men reacted in silence. Some wept, some stared at the ground. One whispered, "So this is how the world ends." No one celebrated. The shooting outside continued for hours. Even surrender couldn't stop the chaos. When the Russians finally entered our position, I saw them clearly for the first time, dirty, exhausted, their faces hard as stone. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like us. One soldier pointed his rifle at me and gestured for me to drop mine. I raised my hands. My fingers were too numb to feel the metal. As they led us away, I looked back at what was once Stalingrad, just ruins, smoke, and silence. The city had swallowed us whole. I remember thinking, this isn't victory or defeat. It's the end of reason itself. We were herded together in small groups, walking through what was left of the city. There were no roads anymore, only paths carved through snow and ruins. Dead men, both German and Russian, lay frozen where they had fallen. The air smelled of smoke, ash, and something worse, the sweet, heavy scent of death. The Russian guards didn't speak much. They watched us carefully, rifles always ready. Some were barely older than us. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes were ancient. We marched for hours. Some men collapsed from exhaustion or hunger. The guards shouted for them to stand, but most couldn't. Those who fell were left behind. That night, they led us to a warehouse that still had a roof. We crowded inside, hundreds of us, shoulder to shoulder. It was dark, freezing, and silent except for coughing. There was no food, only melted snow to drink. I sat beside Franch's empty place. He had been dead for weeks, but I still caught myself looking for him. A Russian medic came once, carrying a lantern. He looked at us, shook his head, and said something quietly to the guard. Then he left. Days passed, maybe weeks. Time had lost all meaning. We talked less and less. Some men whispered prayers, others stared at the walls as if they could see home through them. Then came the order. We were to be transported east. Siberia, someone said. Others laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. The march began again. Snowstorms, hunger, frostbite. Boots tore apart, feet bled through the cloth. I saw men die standing, frozen mid-step. At one point, I stumbled and fell. The guard behind me lifted his rifle, and for a second, I thought it was the end. But instead of shooting, he pulled me up and pointed forward. His face was calm, almost tired. In that moment, I understood. We were all prisoners of this war, German, Russian. It didn't matter anymore. When we finally reached the camp, I didn't feel relief, only emptiness. Barbed wire, wooden huts, smoke rising from small fires, it could have been anywhere. That night, lying on the cold ground, I realized that the war wasn't just around us. It was inside us now, and it would never really end. I don't remember how many winters passed in the camp. Maybe 3, maybe more. The seasons came and went without meaning. Each morning, we lined up for roll call. Some men didn't stand up, they were already gone. We worked cutting wood, hauling stones, building roads through endless forests. The guards watched but rarely spoke. They were not cruel, just indifferent. Death had become ordinary. We learned to survive by habit, to eat slowly, to save a crumb of bread for later, to wrap our feet in rags before sleep. Small rituals, the only thing separating life from nothingness. Sometimes, Russian civilians would come near the camp, women, children. They looked at us without hatred, only weariness. One old woman once slipped me a piece of black bread through the fence. She said nothing. I never forgot her face. By 1946, rumors spread the war was long over, Germany divided, Hitler dead. None of us cheered. We didn't know what home even meant anymore. In 1949, my name was finally called. Repatriation. I walked out of the gates that had defined my world for years. A train took us west, through forests, fields, villages I didn't recognize. People stared at us from the platforms as if we were ghosts. When I arrived in Bavaria, I found ruins where my town used to be. My mother's house was gone. My father had died in an air raid. Only my sister remained, older now, her eyes full of years I had missed. The village welcomed me with awkward silence. No one wanted to talk about the war. Everyone had their own ghosts. At night, I often woke to the sound of distant thunder, though there was no thunder. Just memory. I worked as a mechanic after the war. Quietly, honestly. I never joined any political group again. I repaired engines, bicycles, anything that moved. Machines made sense. People didn't. Sometimes, when winter came, I'd stand outside and watch the snow fall. The same white silence as Stalingrad, but now, peaceful. I never wrote about what happened. Until now. Because people must understand. War isn't glory. It isn't courage. It's the slow, cold death of everything that makes us human.